welcome to a new video on fluid compartments and fluid balance. So what we're going to be looking at in this video today is where the fluid is in the body, how it moves, and what causes it to move to maintain the fluid balance. So in this video, let's go ahead and get started and look at where the fluid is in the body. And so if I'm talking about fluid compartments, what I'm really meaning here is where is the fluid in the body. So these would be body fluid compartments, and there are two major places we will find our fluid. One of these is the intracellular fluid, the fluid inside the cell, the ICF, which we oftentimes refer to as cytosol. And then there is the extracellular fluid, or the ECF, and this is all the fluid outside of the cell. And what is also important is that in the ECF, there are two big major compartments that are subdividing that. And one of these is the interstitial fluid. Now, what we're going to do is we will draw these out, but the interstitial fluid is an important exchange medium between capillaries and the cells. And then we're also going to see plasma, which is also a very big one and very important as well. Now, I'm going to put a third one here, though, in red, as this is a minor compartment of fluid for the fluid balance. This is normally not taken into account for the fluid balance. This is referred to as vascular fluid. Now, my anatomy and physiology students always mention, this is things like cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, lymph, some of your synovial fluids, the things that aren't playing a big role in fluid balance. So let's take and kind of graphically look at this and imagine if we had total body fluid, all the fluid in a human body right here in this box. And in this box, if I were to draw a dotted line here representing a cell membrane here, and that's abbreviated CM for the cell membrane, then we have separated our fluids into the two main compartments, the intracellular fluid, the ICF, and the extracellular fluid, the ECF. Now, first off, what we want to make sure we understand is that I did this disproportional because your ICF is about 2/3 of overall body water would be located inside of your cells. And then the remaining third is outside your cells. So what is important here to take away from this is once you go on to healthcare programs is that you will be doing calculations with body fluids, and it's important to understand that ICF is most of it. And if I'm wanting to say get the blood volume, and one of the ways you will do that, I'll talk about a little bit of that when I get into the further vascular stuff and we talk about those fluids, and I'll show you guys a little bit of that, not much, but I'll give you a little idea how that works. So now let's take this and break this down further. So what we'll do is we'll draw the same drawing again, same rectangle again here. And I'm going to draw my dotted line here, right? And we're going to draw another dotted line here. So remember, this is the intracellular fluid, the ICF, and over here on that side of the dotted line is the ECF, or extracellular fluid. And remember that 2/3 of your body fluid is inside your cells. Now, the remaining of these things, if we were to break down our ECF, we said there was the interstitial fluid, and then there's plasma. Now, these two fluids are different from each other. For example, plasma is going to be much higher in protein, right? Much higher in protein, and so will the ICF be much higher in protein as well. And the interstitial fluid is fairly low protein normally for a person, so that would be a huge difference between these two fluids. Now, the ICF will have a different composition of electrolytes, and so will the ECF electrolytes be different as well. Now, we know that there is a cell membrane separating our interstitial fluid from our ICF, and also there is the capillary wall of the capillaries separating plasma from interstitial fluid. Now, I drew these as dashed lines because I wanted to make sure we understand that these have different levels of permeabilities, and there are different forces that are at play here, right? Now, a few things that we need to know and help understand about this particular drawing is by far, guys, so we already said one of the most important things is to know where most of the fluids is, where most of the fluids are, where we would find them, where they're located, and then the subdivisions of those compartments. But now we need to know how the fluids come and go. So the reason I'm drawing these drawings kind of repeatedly is it just helps in order to keep it clear and me not having any superfluous information here. So let's take this same thing, and I'm just going to go ahead and put ICF here, right? This is the entirety of the ECF. This will be the interstitial fluid, and this is plasma. Now, it's important for us to know that almost the entirety of the water gained and lost by the body occurs at the blood. So the cardiovascular system gains and loses the majority of water for the body, and this is very important. So if we're going to add some fluid to the plasma, and we're going to remove fluid from the plasma, this is how this is happening, and it's important that we know the route of most gains and most losses. By far, most gains are going to be done through the GI tract. The digestive system is where I'm going to gain the majority of water. I drink water. It passes through my digestive tract. It's absorbed by the epithelium of the intestines, where it is transported in through that epithelium into the bloodstream, and now that's in the plasma. So that's how we are adding most of the water in. Most of the water lost is done so by the kidneys, by urine, right? We are going to excrete, we're going to urinate most of our water out. Now, there are two other big places where we do lose water, and skin is a very big thing. Now, with skin, what I want to make sure we understand about skin, if you, those that had me for Anatomy and Physiology 1, we talked about the difference between sensible perspiration and insensible perspiration, and that, see, water loss occurs across the skin. The skin is not a perfect barrier to water loss. Now, sensible perspiration through the skin would be an example of sweating. I can feel sweat beads run down my skin, right? But also, we have insensible perspiration, and this occurs, guys, when the wind blows across the skin, it dehydrates the skin, and we lose water, but we're not aware of that, and that's also very dangerous. And this is where burns come into play, and the risk of dehydration to burn victims is we've lost this barrier, so we have a greater amount of dehydration. We'll pull more water out. But remember that in the normal, happy, healthy human, this is how we're thinking about it. We're not thinking about pathological things. Now, another one, which I didn't talk much about in my lectures, is lungs. And lungs, by breathing, you do lose some water there, right? And you probably all breathed out on a cold day and seen your breath. You probably all breathed onto a mirror and saw your breath precipitating onto that, condensing onto that. So water is lost primarily through kidneys, but we also lose some through the skin and lungs, right? But this is occurring from the plasma to the other kinds of membranes, either the respiratory membrane, the cutaneous membrane, right? And then we're primarily going to gain it through the gut, and we're primarily going to lose it through the kidneys. And this is in the normal, happy, healthy human, right? To maintain homeostasis. So what really gets to become an interesting thing about this is the fluid balance and fluid shifts. Now, just to remind ourselves what fluid balance is, right? Fluid balance is when fluid gained is equal to fluid lost, right? We must always have as much fluid coming into the GI tract, entering into the bloodstream, as we are losing it to stay in balance and stay in homeostasis, right? So that is a very important thing. So what we want to see here next is how does that begin to kind of happen? So we're going to draw our trusty diagrams here in just a minute, but we want to make sure we also understand with fluid balance the two main forces at play with fluid balance and fluid shifts. So fluid balance will involve fluid shifts, right, in order to keep balance, right? Now, we have what is called osmotic pressure. Basically, let's think osmosis is an important factor in moving water. And let's also think about our hydrostatic pressures, like capillary hydrostatic pressures. And what we're going to think about is in different places, the osmotic pressures are different, capillary hydrostatic pressures. So osmotic pressures are very important in moving things across cell membranes to interstitium, and also between interstitium and capillaries themselves to some degree, especially when it comes to reabsorption. And capillary hydrostatic pressure is very important to move fluids from the plasma to interstitial fluids. And what we also will just make sure, give you guys a little rule here, is that usually that osmotic changes, osmosis, would impact your ECF first, right? Because of a variety of reasons. But biggest reason is ECF's on the outside. It's the one that's more on the environment, more impacted by what I ingest. Because remember, let's say along with that water in this diagram here, that I eat some salt, that changes the osmolarity, the osmotic pressure of the plasma, which will pull water from the interstitium into the plasma, right? So you got to think about that. It is that the ECF is going to be affected because it's basically closer to our environment. It's going to be affected very quickly what I eat or drink, what I do in my body, right? So it is going to be the one that changes the first, right? So what is crucial here to understand for the healthcare student is to understand and know where the fluids are, what causes them to move, and where they will move. So if we've got the two major forces that are interacting together, let's begin to look at what will happen. All right. Now, let's say, guys, again, our favorite diagram, which this will help us understand things very well. And let's draw our particular membranes. Remember, we have our ICF and we have our ECF. And that there is the interstitial fluid, there is plasma, and the interstitial fluid of the ICF, we have our cell membrane, and here we have the wall, the capillary, right? So let me put capillary here, and these are the barriers that are going to be working. Now, let's say, guys, that my patient is deficit. They are decreasing their water intake. The water gains are now not exceeding the water loss. So we have a lot of water loss at kidney or through, let's say, a burn victim, or they're just dehydrated because they're not drinking. But right now, this person's water gains is not sufficiently keeping up with their water loss, and the fluid levels are beginning to decrease in that plasma, right? That compartment has lost some fluid. Now, the ECF is most affected by these changes. Now, let's think about this and make sure you guys understand. If I'm removing water, what I'm also doing is I'm increasing the solute in the plasma, making the plasma more hypertonic. The amount of solute is now creeping up in our plasma, and these solutes are water-soluble or hydrophilic. Now think about it. If it's hydrophilic, that means water's going to want to move to it. That means it's going to pull water from the interstitium inside, and it's going to drop the interstitial fluid down, right? It will raise up this a little bit and put these two fluids into balance. Now these two fluids have shifted, but now your ECF is a little bit more hypertonic in comparison to the ICF, and the ICF will begin to lose some fluid, right? And that will help maintain some balance. So hypertonicities in the ECF will move water osmotically from the ICF to help to maintain balance. So a dehydrated patient will start losing, they will start to take their cells, will begin to shrivel down a little bit as they lose volume. Now this could also be a blood cell, and that's when we talk about crenation and osmosis. So this is a big part of the fluid shift, and I hope you guys understand it now a little bit better. And the other thing that will help us visualize, so do you see that what's happening here is fluid gained is not exceeding fluid loss in the plasma. Plasma volume had went down, right, to this level, right? Our interstitium shifted fluids to the plasma to raise a little bit of that fluid back up. And then our ICF then adjusted for that as well to get that fluid, right? And now we're here, we are losing that fluid. We don't have that, but we can intervene. We can have that patient drink more fluid, give them IV fluids, what have you. And then what will happen is the vice versa thing will happen, right? So remember, the ECF will change first, and then the ICF, because the ECF is closer to our environment and is going to be affected first by any fluid changes. And that's a very important thing when you're in healthcare to understand, right? When you're giving the IV fluids, what have you, right? So let's take this a little bit differently and begin to look at the same thing. Remember, we have a cell membrane and we have a capillary. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about the different things going on between the forces a little bit more. But let's take our ICF, our ECF, our interstitial fluids, and our plasma. Now, let's say here for some reason, guys, so let's say they have an increase in fluid intake, and they are not losing fluid fast enough, right? One of those things could be going on here. So they are hypohydrated, right? Now, what could happen is, as these fluids will want to shift, we are now diluting these fluids, right? The plasma is too dilute, right? We'll shift fluids into the interstitium and shift into the ICF. Now, the problem could be is that with this patient, is if there's no room for that fluid, we've got to get this to clear that fluid for them, right? So it's basically what I want you guys to see here is the fluids to go back to homeostasis where this patient was. If I can reverse this and also add the fluid back, we will be back into homeostasis. But in certain disease conditions, we have to intervene because in the normal, happy, healthy human, they're not going to be able to clear that fluid. There's no place for it to go. So what's going to happen is this fluid may accumulate. We get the edema beginning to occur, right? And things like that begin to happen. So knowing the direction of fluid movement is a very important aspect to this. Now there is one last thing I want to begin to mention to you guys and really to spend a little bit of time talking about, even though I will be doing a separate video on this by itself, is how things do move between plasma and the interstitial fluids. And let's say here I have my tissues, right? Here's my tissues that I want to supply blood to. Well, remember that you have blood coming in and leaving. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but remember that you have the capillary hydrostatic pressures is the forces pushing from the inside of the capillary wall, pushing outwards. And then, guys, inside our plasma are little proteins in this plasma, and the most important one would be a protein called albumin. And albumin is the most important protein that generates blood colloidal osmotic pressure. Okay? It is by far the most important thing to create blood colloidal osmotic pressure. If you were to look at these globular proteins, there are charges on them, positives and negatives, and it makes it hydrophilic. Okay? And that means that it's water-loving, and that water, who is a polar molecule, will get attracted to these proteins and want to move towards it. So the forces have to be in balance. Capillary hydrostatic pressure and blood colloidal osmotic pressure are two forces that are in opposition. When they are in balance and equal, there is no fluid movement. Just remember, fluid follows force. Fluid follows force, right? Fluids will always go wherever the greatest force is. Now, we are on an end where there's an arteriole that the capillary hydrostatic pressures are far greater. Now, even though blood colloidal osmotic pressure is present, it's just not greater than the capillary hydrostatic pressure. And this will force fluids out to the interstitium. Mid-range, kind of midstream in the capillary, these two forces are equal, so fluid just enters and leaves. There is really no net fluid movement, and this is where gases would exchange. Now, what happens is at the end where the venules are of a capillary bed, the capillary hydrostatic pressure drops tremendously so that blood colloidal osmotic pressure is actually greater than it. And this will cause fluids to enter the capillary. So these are the forces. Now I'm going to do a whole video on that just to look at it by itself and explain it a little bit better. But these are the forces that are causing the movements here at the capillary bed. So remember, when we lose fluids, we are going to shift our fluids back to the plasma, try to get everything back into balance. Then we will intervene medically and try to get fluids back. When we are gaining too much fluids, we may have to draw the fluids, intervene medically to remove it from the bloodstream or elsewhere, right? So, and this is the primary forces that help cause these changes in the capillary beds. So I will be doing a video in the near future to look at fluid compositions especially in the ECF when we look at electrolytes. But guys, I hope you found this video helpful. Please take time to comment, subscribe, like, make statements. Let me know on my Facebook page at Human Anatomy and Physiology Education on Facebook to see if there's anything you would like to see me do in future videos. I'd like to thank you so much for watching. Please take that time just to let me know if these help you. Thank you and have a wonderful day.